chaos in Kyrgyzstan as opposition supporters seize the country's parliament. And Boris Johnson's bold plan for every British household to be powered by wind energy. You're watching The World. Also tonight, exposing the disturbing practice of shackling used on people suffering from mental illness. Well, as Donald Trump continues his recovery from COVID-19, he has upended support for millions of Americans affected by the pandemic, less than a month out from the election. In a move that surprised his own advisers, the US president pulled the plug on talks with the Democrats aimed at cementing a stimulus package worth at least $1.6 trillion. Mr. Trump took to his medium of choice, tweeting his disagreement with White House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's request for $2.4 trillion to deal with the pandemic. He went on to accuse Ms. Pelosi of not negotiating in good faith and says he'll only pass a stimulus bill after he wins November's election. In response, Ms. Pelosi says the president is putting himself first.
It's unfortunate because he has abandoned our children. We had such great provisions in the bill. Not that they agreed to all of them yet, but we were on a path. They abandoned our workers, what we need to do for America's working families. They abandoned our fight to crush the virus, which they have ignored and that we insist upon in this bill, and they ignored our heroes.
Meantime, as more of Donald Trump's inner circle tests positive to the virus, he's fighting another battle on the COVID front. This time, it's with the Food and Drug Administration that has released new guidelines requiring vaccine developers to provide at least 2 months of safety data before it can authorise any emergency use. Now, that's effectively dashed the American president's hopes of having a vaccine ready before November the 3rd, Election Day, when the majority of voters will go to the polls. Donald Trump accused the FDA of pulling off a political hit job with its new rules. And less than a week out from the next presidential debate, his rival Joe Biden is riding high in the polls, with the new CNN poll giving him a 16-point lead over Trump. The Democratic candidate says there shouldn't be a second presidential debate next week if Trump is still COVID positive.
Well, I think if he still has COVID, we shouldn't have a debate. In a debate, I think, by the way, I think we're going to have to follow very strict guidelines. Too many people have been infected, and it's a very serious problem. And so I'll be guided by the guidelines of the Cleveland Clinic and what the docs say the right thing to do, if and when he shows up for debate.
And we'll have more on the FDA's vaccine guidelines with epidemiologist Nancy Baxter a little later in the program. Well, after a marathon 5.5-year trial, members of Greece's Golden Dawn political party have been found guilty of several crimes, including running a criminal organisation. Police used tear gas and water cannon to disperse protesters outside the Athens courthouse as judges ruled on the landmark case. More than 15,000 supporters of the self-proclaimed fascist party attended the rally. Opponents of Golden Dawn say the ruling is a victory against fascism. A total of 68 of the party's leaders and members went on trial and now face between 5 to 15 years in jail. Well, staying in Greece, and hundreds of refugees from Lesbos Island have been resettled in other countries across Europe. They waited in line as authorities checked their details before boarding a ferry destined for their new home. All 872 refugees were tested for COVID before setting sail. A total of 1,066 asylum seekers have left Greece to start their new lives so far this year. Well, political uncertainty continues to intensify in the Central Asian nation of Kyrgyzstan, where opposition groups say they have seized power after storming government buildings during post-election protests. While officials say the disputed results will be annulled, the country's Prime Minister has resigned and the President says the country is facing an attempted coup. Here's Rachel Merritt.
This is the moment when opposition forces stormed Kyrgyzstan's parliamentary building in the capital Bishkek. removing furniture and throwing documents out the window, then symbolically removing the portrait of the man at the centre of the growing political unrest. The opposition councils say they have now claimed power from the president and his government following days of civil unrest.
We need to get rid of old faces and have clean lawmakers who will work for the people. We need a new, clean parliament.
The president, still clinging to power, has called for stability and accused opposition forces of using the elections to violate public order.
They did not obey law enforcement agencies, beat paramedics and damaged buildings. I ordered the law enforcement agencies not to open fire so there was no blood spilt and not a single citizen was injured.
Thousands of protesters rallied earlier this week following the results of an election many believe was marred by vote buying, with most seats handed to two parties supporting closer links with Russia. The electoral body has since annulled the contested results.
Before the day of the election, there were numerous complaints about bribery, use of advantages of administrative officers. We informed the law enforcement agencies, who, however, did not resolve these issues in time.
While officials say the election will be rerun, the opposition is pressing forward with plans for a provisional government. They also freed high-profile political detainees, including former President Amalzbek Atambayev, who was jailed on corruption charges. Another freed politician has been installed as the new Prime Minister, with plans to propose constitutional reform and hold presidential and parliamentary elections in 2 to 3 months. But with both the President and opposition locked in a struggle for power, it's not clear who would organise a future vote or steer the country out of troubled times. Rachel Merritt, ABC News.
2 women have won this year's Nobel Prize for Chemistry for developing the tools to edit DNA. Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna pioneered the technology of genome editing, paving the way for scientists to make specific changes to the DNA contained in living cells. Their work has contributed to many important innovations in medicine, including new cancer therapies. They are the first women to share the prize without a male collaborator. Well, last night's budget unleashed hundreds of billions of dollars, some of which started flowing today, to try to jumpstart the COVID-stalled economy. It's built on tax cuts worth between $20 and $50 a week, among several other measures. But it comes at a cost, funded by years' worth of deep deficits, building a debt mountain that will nudge $1 trillion within 4 years. Here's National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett.
Follow COVID rules, shield and cover from airborne droplets, overextend if you have to. And at all times, move and speak in unison with optimism.
We're going to feel even more confident about the future.
So you're Channel 7, I believe, first.
Good morning, Prime Minister.
Scott Morrison, thank you for joining us.
Appreciate your time this morning.
It's their money. People can keep more of what they earn. Hello, Mr Prime Minister.
We are talking big numbers.
The Brawley-based budget marketing's much like any other year.
We want to go. Okay, good.
But no government's ever had to sell a product quite like this before. The job creation, the wage subsidies and the tax cuts are meeting almost no resistance.
The sooner the better for that tax relief. We fully support the bring forward of stage 2.
Laws to enact the $17 billion tax cuts will pass the Parliament, and the extra $20 to $50 a week will land in pay packets once it does. But as for taxes already paid at the current higher rate,
That will be payable at the end of the year.
taxpayers will have to wait for a refund next July. Wage subsidies for young workers aged up to 35 come sooner from today, raising questions about whether it skews the job market.
For young Australians who will be entering into the job market, it's going to be a lot harder.
Harder because the young will inherit the lot. When the debt piles higher,
Gross debt, it's $1.7 trillion. Mr. Speaker, in 2030...
is branded and then politically charged.
Racking up $1 trillion of Liberal debt during the Morrison recession.
He demonstrates, Mr Speaker, his lack of understanding of the Australian economy.
The political potency of this budget isn't obvious just yet. Judgments will come on results, probably around the middle of next year. Achieve the predictions on jobs and a return to growth, and the plaudits would follow. Miss them, And voter patience and gratitude would also be tested. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, last night, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg announced $5.7 billion of the budget will go towards the mental health sector. But this move has been criticised by the Pacific community, who have been unable to access treatment because of language and cultural barriers. Mental health researcher Lefualii Dionenari explains what needs to be done for help to inform Australians from different backgrounds.
They can throw more funding at organisations like Beyond Blue and add more psychology sessions, but as a Pacific person and Pacific communities and pretty much a lot of other ethnic communities will find that useless if their advice they're giving is inappropriate or even wrong in our own cultural context. So I really believe that these organizations really need to turn and look at different alternative ways of approaching mental health.
Well, let's go back to the United States, and Donald Trump has slammed the Food and Drug Administration after it released new guidelines for any vaccine release. Now, this means any chance of getting a COVID vaccine before the presidential election is looking unlikely. Dr. Nancy Baxter is head of the School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne, and she joins us from Melbourne. Nancy, great to talk to you again. Now, the president tried to block these new guidelines. The FDA pushed ahead regardless. How unusual is it for a health issue like this to be so politicised?
Well, Donald Trump has been politicizing this from very early on in terms of pressuring the FDA to approve drugs through their emergency use approval, emergency use authorization. And that's led to things like hydroxychloroquine being approved and then subsequently proven to not be effective. So this has really become politicized, which is really unfortunate, because what we need is for people to really trust that vaccines, once they're approved, are going to be safe and effective.
Is that why the FDA went ahead and published these new guidelines very publicly?
Well, I think even the drug companies creating the vaccines were really concerned about political pressure being put on them to approve vaccines. So, you know, you have these major companies signing on to say that no matter what the FDA does, they're not going to release the vaccines until they're sure that they're safe and effective. So I think the FDA was in a real bind, but they had kind of this backing by the companies as well as the scientists. So I think that they were able to actually just put their foot down and say, you know, we're going to make it easier to approve these vaccines. So we're not going to have the same regulatory process that we do usually for vaccines, but we're not going to rush it just so that someone can win an election.
Yes, because I can imagine the reputational damage to any company that rushed a vaccine would be devastating.
You know, when you have a vaccine, you're giving it to millions, and in this case, potentially billions of people who, you know, have actually a low chance of dying from the disease. So the risk balance equation, you have to have very low risks with vaccines. So, you know, if you really rush this, they're already not going to really be testing it on as many people or watching them for as long as they usually do. So, you know, if you rush it even more, you know, and suddenly you give it to 100,000 people and people suffer and there are complications from it, it is going to be real reputational damage for these companies. So I think they're very concerned about that.
What are the chances of any of these vaccine developers having a vaccine that could be potentially ready for emergency distribution before Election Day?
I don't think any are going to be ready to distribute a vaccine before Election Day, but there is one. Pfizer has one candidate vaccine that could possibly be submitted to the FDA before that. Now, that may be based on as few as 32 people who contracted COVID that were in their study. So that's a very low number, and one that, you know, usually people who won't take vaccines, there's vaccine hesitancy. These are people who, you know, don't take vaccines that are proven safe and effective for their children. But now even scientists are saying, well, maybe I'd want to look at the data before I decided whether I really wanted that vaccine. And that is really unusual. So people who usually trust the science are saying, you know, I'm going to have to really look at this before I decide this is right for me. Yeah. So I hope there's no rush because, you know, although waiting a little longer, you know, we were all very anxious to get the vaccine out. it is really important that we know the safety and effectiveness, at least as best we can, before we distribute this widely.
What do you make of how Donald Trump has publicly managed his own diagnosis? I mean, he went to hospital for a couple of days, but he's back in saying he's never felt better, that he might be immune. He's sort of sending, and also telling people that there's nothing to fear.
Well, I think it's yet one more disappointment. You know, one would think that, you know, essentially he contracted the disease because he did not protect himself or his staff. And now there's an outbreak at the White House that they've had a super spreader event. One would think that after that, and actually being affected yourself, and given his age, his, you know, he's not a good weight, you know, he has a significant risk of dying. Like, he has a 5 to 10% risk of dying of this infection. And even though he's doing okay now, you know, he could still be severely affected because, you know, there's at the initial infection, but there's also a risk 7 to 10 days after. So he's not out of the woods. So you'd think that after this, one might reflect on one's behavior and one's leadership and change. But no, instead, as soon as he comes back to the White House, he takes off his mask and then goes back in and potentially infects everyone who's working at the White House. So these are people working in the kitchen, people cleaning the White House, who are potentially going to be infected by Donald Trump because he's, you know, just not wearing a mask, not willing to isolate.
Yeah,
and it's remarkable.
It is remarkable, and also discussing the potential of yet another debate, even if he tests COVID positive. It is hard to know necessarily whether he is now just abandoning all caution with regard to the election as the only thing that's important to him right now.
It does seem to be. You know, there are many things that he's doing that seem not to make sense in with any other lens. But, you know, just because Trump wants to participate in the debate doesn't mean that they have to have a debate. If he has not been at least 10 days since having the illness, you know, it's really not safe for anybody. So, you know, maybe they could do something remotely if he's feeling well, but there's no way there should be anything in person. I mean, it's just not safe.
Nancy, always good to get your insights. Thanks so much.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And good news that the vaccine might be close.
Yes, let's hope so. Well, no more coal-fired boilers and reduced carbon emissions. That's what Jacinda Ardern is promising New Zealanders if she wins the election next week. The Prime Minister says she wants to see more people driving electric cars as one of several ways to tackle climate change.
We have to make sure that we are targeting those areas where we do see a significant contribution to our emissions. And industrial heat is one of them. And so this is why we are taking those next steps in our action on climate change.
And the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has promised that by 2030 every British household will be powered by offshore wind energy. The British PM was once a critic of the technology, but he now says it's the guilt-free future. Nick Dole has more from London.
This is Battersea Power Station on the south bank of the Thames. It's in the process of a massive transformation, being turned into offices and apartments. But as a coal-fired power station, it once provided about 20% of London's energy. Coal now makes up just 3% of Britain's energy mix. Nuclear and gas still do a lot of the heavy lifting, but renewables account for about 45% of the UK's energy, whereas in Australia it's closer to 20%. Much of the UK's renewable generation comes from offshore wind farms, and now Boris Johnson has pledged that by 2030 these turbines will power every British household.
You heard me right. Your kettle, your washing machine, your cooker, your heating, your plug-in electric vehicle, a whole lot of them will get their juice cleanly and without guilt from the breezes that blow around these islands.
The Prime Minister says he wants the UK to be to wind what Saudi Arabia is to oil. Boris Johnson once said that wind farms couldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding. Well, today he all but admitted he was wrong.
Well, Russia has successfully test-launched a hypersonic cruise missile in the Barents Sea on the 68th birthday of President Vladimir Putin. The leader has been pledging to increase Russia's military presence in the Arctic and talked up hypersonic missiles during his speech in 2018. A senior army chief said the missile reached hypersonic speeds before reaching its 450-kilometre target in 4.5 minutes. Australian Foreign Minister Marise Payne has met with her Japanese counterpart to discuss the strategic partnership between the two nations, meeting in Tokyo as part of four-way talks between Japan, India, Australia and the United States. The two ministers agreed to broaden security measures and deepen cooperation in the face of changing conditions in the region.
We have a special strategic partnership and we have great potential to further advance our cooperation. I'm looking forward to having deep discussions on our bilateral relationship today.
Stephen Nagy is a Senior Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at International Christian University in Tokyo. He says those so-called Quad meetings of regional allies comes at a rather interesting time in geopolitics.
Well, I think it's important that the four members, the United States, Japan, Australia and India, have come together in the post-COVID-19 period for the first time, and that they've explicitly talked about the challenges that the countries are facing and the region is facing, in particular Chinese assertive behavior in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, on the Himalayan Plateau, and that they are focused on trying to change the nature of the Quad. And that means moving away from a securitarized kind of institution or dialogue to something that can really provide some different kinds of needs to the international community and Indo-Pacific in general.
What might that look like, though?
Well, I think that if we look at the stakeholders within the region and we look at countries like Australia, Japan, and India, their biggest trading partner is China. There's only so far that they're going to push in terms of a security strategy and trying to push back against China. Of course, they have problems with China, but that economic partnership is really critical to their prosperity. So when we think about the direction of those three countries, I think that focusing on non-traditional security cooperation in the region, search and rescue, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, building infrastructure and connectivity, and diversifying supply chains are key areas that I think that they would get a lot of buy-in, not just from Australia, Japan, and India, but also Southeast Asian countries, who are really at the core of the Indo-Pacific. This doesn't mean there's not a security pillar to the Quad, but what it means is that there's much more to the Quad than just security.
Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, has been particularly critical of China, accusing the CCP of exploitation, corruption and coercion. Do countries like Australia and Japan have to be careful not to be caught in the middle of that deteriorating US-China relationship?
Well, I think that they have many of the same challenges, but how they're articulating that is very, very different. There's a more diplomatic approach. They prefer backdoor diplomacy to deal with these challenges. And again, I don't think they want to tie themselves to the same narrative that the Trump administration is pursuing, in particular focus on the Communist Party and the focus on really changing the nature of China itself. These are no-go zones that I think Japan, Australia, and India understand, and that they'd like to deal with the challenge of China in the region through other means. And again, I think going back to the economic pillar, infrastructure pillar, connectivity pillar, these are important areas that I think they can get a lot of buy-in from regional stakeholders to shape and perhaps push China in a more positive direction.
China, of course, sees this as a sort of exclusive clique. I wonder if are there any possibility for countries to work with China in a different way?
Here again, I think going back to non-traditional security issues, there's a lot of room for China to come in and contribute to its enormous capacities to dealing with illegal fishing and piracy and climate change. And I think that this is where Australia and Japan and India and the United States should find ways to make a more inclusive region and ensure that China does find a place to contribute to a regional public good in a multilateral setting. And I think that that's hopefully the direction that the Quad will move. The question is what is the direction that China is going to move?
Can we expect any tangible agreements out of these discussions? Of course, we know we're living in a very uncertain time with the pandemic still very much gripping the globe.
At this particular stage, I think that the fact that the four partners couldn't come together with a joint statement of what they'd like to do suggests that at this particular stage, we're not going to be able to find or establish a joint platform to move forward in terms of the Quad. But moving forward, I think that after the U.S. election, after we know who's going to be in the White House, that countries will be much more committed to moving the Quad in a different direction, depending on who is going to be the leader of the United States.
So let me ask you that. If Joe Biden should become the US president, do you think things will shift quite dramatically in terms of the dynamic that's been there between particularly the US and China?
At this stage, I think it's hard to tell. The United States is very divided. I think that even if a potential President Biden is elected, I think that we will see more multilateralism. We'll see more commitment by the United States to take a multilateral diplomatic approach to dealing with China. But that being said, there is a power change within the region. I think that China understands that it's an opportunity to reshape the region so that it's friendlier towards its authoritarian system and towards achieving some of its core interests. And this is going to be a challenge, whether it's a President Trump or a President Biden. And I think countries within the region will prefer a multilateral approach, but at the same time, they're going to prefer a continuation of a harder line approach to dealing with China's assertive behavior in the region.
Stephen, good to talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Well, first came US Marines. Now another batch of international troops are in the top end, with 200 Singaporean Air Force personnel preparing to begin a training exercise near Darwin. After a fortnight in hotel quarantine, Singaporean Air Force members are being deployed for air combat exercises later this month. From today, maintenance crews will begin working on the Bradshaw training grounds in preparation for the exercises, which include flying, training and live weapons practice. Prior to quarantining in Darwin, the troops isolated for 1 week in their home country took a COVID-19 test 48 hours before travelling to the territory. The exercises will run until December. Well, the music industry and fans are mourning the loss